Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Uli, and this is episode 117 of the Forge of Freedom. Today, I've got an article I want to share with you from the Intellectual Takeout, and the article is called The Zone of Interest in Forgiveness. And The Zone of Interest, for those who don't know, is a movie that is set around the time of World War II, and it's about Rudolf Höss. He was the Commandant of Auschwitz, which was, of course, the concentration camp, the extermination camp in Poland, and during World War II. And I'm sharing this article because we're on the heels of Easter. And over Easter weekend, I was thinking a lot about forgiveness and mercy, and then also one of my good friends recommended this movie to me, and then of course I came upon this article as well, and it sparked my interest in this question of forgiveness, and then also it sort of relates back to a previous episode about how seemingly ordinary people can be driven to do horrendous things. And this article, again, is called The Zone of Interest in Forgiveness, and it's an article by Michael Cook. I'll link to it, of course, in the show notes. It's at intellectualtakeout.org. So let's get into it. The Zone of Interest won 2 Oscars this year. It is a highly stylized dissection of the character of Rudolf Höss, the Commandant of Auschwitz. In his cozy home with a wall separating his family from the horrors of the extermination camp, Höss was the kindly father of 5 children. On the other side, he was responsible for the deaths of 3 million people, mostly Jews and Poles. The film ends after he discovers that he is going to be responsible for exterminating 430,000 Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz. Himmler has even named this logistical challenge after him, Operation Höss. Höss is honored. The news puts a spring in his step, although something deep within him is revolted, and he vomits as he fades out of the film. If anyone was evil, it was Rudolf Höss. He was a monster. What he did was unspeakable and unforgivable. But we can learn more from Höss's life than man's capacity for surrendering to the darkest forms of evil. That's a lesson that we all need to learn by heart. But the real-life story is also, amazingly, a lesson in mercy. Höss was raised in a stern Catholic family, but he drifted away from religion in his teens. In 1922, he formally abjured his Catholic faith and ended up as a Nazi fanatic. He became an expert at running concentration camps, not only Auschwitz, but also the hellish prisons of Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück. At the end of the war, he disappeared into the chaos and found work as a gardener. He was eventually tracked down by the British. They handed him over to the Poles because the worst of his crimes had been committed on Polish territory. He was tried in a Polish court and sentenced to death. Höss was almost unique amongst the upper echelons of the Nazis. With some equivocation, he admitted that he was responsible for killing 3 million people. As he awaited execution, he wrote an autobiography in which he expresses his remorse. He wrote a letter to the state prosecutor 4 days before his execution, in which he said, "My conscience compels me to make the following declaration. In the solitude of my prison cell, I have come to the bitter recognition that I have sinned gravely against humanity. As Commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction. In so doing, I have inflicted terrible wounds on humanity. I caused unspeakable suffering for the Polish people in particular. I am to pay for this with my life. May the Lord God forgive one day what I have done. I asked the Polish people for forgiveness. In Polish prisons, I experienced for the first time what human kindness is. Despite all that has happened, I have experienced humane treatment which I could never have expected, and which has deeply shamed me. May the facts which are now coming out about the horrible crimes against humanity make the repetition of such cruel acts impossible for all time. A week or so before his execution, Höss insisted on seeing a priest. The authorities had some difficulty in finding one who could speak German. Eventually, the head of the Jesuits in Poland, who spoke it fluently, came to see him. They spoke for several hours. Höss formally returned to the faith of his childhood and made his confession. The next day, he received the sacrament of Holy Communion. He was hanged at Auschwitz on April 16, 1947. There's something disturbing about a God who could forgive Rudolf Höss. He was the worst of monsters, a sane monster who knew what he was doing was evil, but immersed himself in it, embraced it, luxuriated in it. His cold-blooded, rational brutality is terrifying. Yet Christians believe that God was ready to forgive him if he repented. Of all of Christianity's unsettling beliefs, this may be the hardest to accept. It seems unjust that a man who killed 3 million people could be embraced as a prodigal son. Of course, forgiveness is only extended to those who are truly repentant. Skeptics might object that Höss was feigning contrition as a balm for his wounded self-esteem, or that he was sorry that the Nazis lost, or that he was sorry that he had been caught. They might even be right, but the Christian God would forgive him if he repented. Along with Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, and all the other bywords for evil in our history. We don't know, of course, if they repented. If Höss did escape hell, Catholics believe that he would have to expiate his monstrous deeds in purgatory, perhaps suffering there until the end of the world. But eventually he would be admitted to heaven. The Zone of Interest won its Oscars in the middle of Lent, when Christians prepare to commemorate the death of Jesus on Good Friday. Pastors of all Christian denominations are probably preparing sermons about the incredible mercy, the amazing grace of the Redeemer. Is there anyone who illustrates this shocking doctrine better than Rudolf Höss? So I share that article not so much as a reflection on the Christian faith as sort of a reflection on forgiveness, and then partly also as a reflection on the Christian faith. I mean, the message that the author here, that Michael Cook talks about, that pastors of all Christian denominations are probably preparing sermons about the incredible mercy, the amazing grace of the Redeemer, is that by professing belief in God, in Jesus, that you have eternal forgiveness and life in heaven. And that forgiveness applies to anyone, including someone like Rudolf Höss. So if the person that Christians believe in Jesus Christ, can forgive someone like Rudolf Höss, what does that say about us, right? That should we also forgive people like Rudolf Höss? And what does that look like? But also, how do we prevent these sorts of things from happening? How do we prevent people like Rudolf Höss, people in power in the Nazi regime, from coming to power again? Those sorts of people, those power-hungry people. And I think that it's an important lesson to reflect on, and it's important history to remember. as we've said on this show before, there's a famous, commonly asserted quote that those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I think that this is an example of that. I thought during COVID, or prior to COVID, rather, how could something like the Holocaust happen? And there's no way that something like it could happen today. But then during COVID and during the pandemic, you saw this sort of mass psychosis, as Tom Woods calls it in his book, The Diary of a Psychosis, this sort of monomaniacal fixation on avoiding exposure to one virus at the expense of everything else. And that sort of mass sort of compliance, that sort of mass monomaniacal fixation made me realize that something like this is possible today. Of course, this sort of extermination hasn't happened since World War II, but it's manifested in other ways, this sort of falling in line, this sort of compliance with authority. And as I said, I talked about this in a previous episode, which I'll link to in the show notes. It's an interesting experiment that was conducted, and that was back in episode 17. Were the perpetrators of the Holocaust just following orders? Let me talk about the Milgram experiment in that episode. If you haven't heard that episode, go back and listen to that. I'll link to that in the show notes. But anyway, I hope that this gives you some food for thought. Again, I think, and what does this have to do with the Forge of Freedom? Well, I think that reflecting on these sorts of problems, these examples from history, helps us to sort of understand how these sorts of things occur and how to avoid them in the future. So I hope that check out the movie, The Zone of Interest. I think you'll enjoy it. And reflect on this question about forgiveness, about mercy, and what that says about us as humans, and then also about your faith if you're a Christian. And I think that there's a powerful message there. And what does this forgiveness say about how we treat people in our own lives here on earth? I'm not suggesting that murderers should be set free or that crimes should simply be forgotten. But I think that it's something that we should reflect on when we think about how we interact with others in our day-to-day lives, and really how we treat crime and certain types of crimes in particular, especially the nonviolent sorts of crimes. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the article. I hope it gave you some food for thought. I've never been to Auschwitz in particular. I have been to Dachau, and it is a very humbling experience that humankind could engage in such atrocities. And at Dachau, there's a sculpture that says never again. And so like the point of it is that the maintenance and the reason that Dachau is maintained and that they have the exhibits that they have there is to remember the atrocity so that it won't ever happen again. And I hope that this article and that this movie can serve that same purpose. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Next week, I'm going to be talking about the FISA 702 debacle that's been going down in Congress today in the House of Representatives, which is, of course, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and how the House of Representatives representatives today reauthorized FISA, and without the amendment that would require a warrant if the surveillance included an American citizen. So I think clearly flies in the face of the Fourth Amendment. It expands the tyranny, the surveillance, the prying eyes of the government. And I think people should know about it. I think it's widely underreported and misrepresented the way it's used. Of course, it's promoted with fear primarily, with very little data to support its efficacy. And of course, even if it were effective, it clearly flies in the face of the Constitution. So anyway, stay tuned for that. That'll be next week. I'll talk about that as well as what we might do to protect ourselves from this sort of mass surveillance and the prying eyes of the government. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. As always, you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, and all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. I'm also on X at Forge of Freedom and at theforgeoffreedom.com. Thanks once again, everybody, and until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.